Cool. Hello, everyone that's here. To the DMs or just players that are here, or to anyone that's watching on YouTube. This is the DM workshop for Dungeons and Dragons at IU. My name is Tyler Sterle, and Jacob Sievert will be accompanying me today to talk all about improvisation in your games. Just the fact that this is indeed a game, and not so much like a book or movie. In games, players are going to have choices, and with that choices and with that agency, things might not always go exactly as planned and or exactly as you thought. So an important component to D&D that we thought we'd want to be covering is this idea of improvisation, and how to think on your feet and prepare for the things you can't really prepare for.
Yeah. I mean, Tyler just knocked out a bunch of our starting points right there, so I'm trying to jump ahead a bit. Um, and so one of the things we were talking about is the line for when to use improv and when not to. Like D&D is a hugely improvisational game, but if you do everything with improv, you're gonna hit a wall somewhere. You can't just constantly expect your imagination to be that good to keep going. Like even professional people who do improv for their entire life, like people on Whose Line Is It Anyway, eventually are gonna run out of material.
Mhm.
So as much as we talk about improv, you still have to make sure you have your skeleton for an encounter. The story that grows from it is the improv that happens between as the players interact with your ideas that you've already seeded to begin with.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. So with that idea of like the skeleton, it's that when you have ideas for an encounter that are already set up, that it is possible that they might go like a particular way, like one or two ways. So it's possible, like let's say, for example, you set up like a simple encounter of like a couple of your players, and like they are about to possibly like ambush a goblin camp. So you could have like two to three possible ways that they might go about this. Like maybe they take like a stealthy route and like they end up doing like something by surprise, or they just go like full gung ho and start running in there, or maybe they try to negotiate by like taking the leader hostage or something like that. But other times it could turn up into something completely unexpected. At least in my games, I've noticed that this happens literally every game. Uh, but the important thing about that is, like he was saying earlier, Jacob, with the skeleton, is that it's important to at least be setting up the environment, like setting the stage for the players, so that once they have all of these sort of variables around them, like they have what's going on, like with their characters and the setting, that you can sort of organically adapt around that, and that you are setting the scene for them, and then they are interacting with that, and that's why it's more so called the skeleton.
Yeah, and as you go in and you fill in those details that like you weren't planned out or your reactions to player things, one of the key things to remember is when you tell a player something, it sets it in stone in the world. You can't
Mhm.
go back, you can't renege it, whatever. Um, and so especially when you're unsure, even as a DM, you have to still be very forceful. Using words like maybe or it might be like, be very careful how you use those. Like if you're using maybe, have it be because they had a perception check and it's a hazy figure, and so you're throwing out some ideas of things that might be, and they're not sure as a their player character. But if you use, oh, maybe it's some goblin village, and then you switch it to be orcs, well, goblins and orcs look incredibly different. That's just you having an issue with how quickly you're committing to things. Even if it's not perfect, you're better off just setting something in stone and continuing to roll with it. And that's fine because the players don't know what your plan was in the original. If you have something that you're like, oh, I meant to do this, they don't know unless you tell them. So just don't tell them that. um, it's kind of the nice thing about improv is that if you just keep rolling with it, it's hard for people to tell what's improv, what's pre-planned. Um, that's why it works so well in this setting.
Yeah, and the great thing about that too, I think what Jacob was saying is that, in a sense, like what you say as the DM is basically law. So like the players have to go with it. It's this sort of like expectation that that what you say is like how it's supposed to go. So like even if you're not entirely confident about like something that you're making up like on the spot, like say players go into like some general goods store and they're like, I want to buy like 20 or 40 feet of rope, and you may have the exact price already prepared for like rope in general, or how much by foot you can pay for rope. But a lot of times, like when there's something that you don't know the price to, you could say like, oh, it's like 50 or like 5 silver per like 5 feet or something like that, or just make something up kind of like almost on the spot, or at least something make it reasonable. But if you are going to do that, like Jacob said, it's important to basically just commit to it, like just to stick to it, make harder numbers, and then like be going with that instead of saying like it may be this, it may be that, because they have to react like based on what you say. And a lot of times, you'd be surprised by times where it's okay to generally make some sort of like figure or number, as long as it's like in the best interest of the game and continuously going towards that goal of just trying to make a good story with your group.
Yeah, that actually leads really well into the next point I wanted to talk about. You use the example of the money and prices in the game, and D&D does have many tables listing all the various prices for items. No DM has that memorized. Very few have it easily pulled up. It's just something that you get this knowledge of things are roughly these prices. And as Tyler said, that's in the interest of moving the game along quickly. But even for more complicated rulings, whether it's spells or combat or whatever, more often than not, you're better off making a quick ruling and saying, like, this is what it is, which is part of the improv as well. And then rolling with that. And maybe afterwards, you consult the rule book and you say, okay, I made a really bad ruling there. Like, maybe I misunderstood rogue sneak attack and just said they could have it for this one they shouldn't have. Then that is one of the few things that I would come back as a DM and say, "Hey, last session we did it this way. I looked back over the rules when I had more time and wasn't holding up the session. From now on, we're going to do it this way." But that's because it's the rules that everybody can access. When you're talking about the world, it's something that's you're the only one in control of. So if you suddenly shift things back, people are gonna question you a bit and wonder like, why are we shifting this? What happened? That like sometimes maybe your notes just got mixed up, but um, it's kind of the separation between the two types of improv that you can do there.
Yeah, and even with those rulings too, if there is something like for say like you, no one really knows the exact ruling for sneak attack, and maybe you don't look it up right there, you could even say, like, let's rule it this way, and then if you want to go back after the session and like go see and look up the exact ruling of that, and then just say, okay, before the game starts, we found the ruling for this, so this is actually how it's supposed to go. Like if I remember one time, one of my games, I wasn't sure if someone could cast a bonus action spell and a regular spell in the same turn. And so, like, we would just say, like, you could in that one situation. Then we later figured out that, like, you actually couldn't, but it was just in the interest of moving that game along and, helping with the sort of like the pacing and the flow of that experience. Um, and Jacob, did you want to talk about the adjectives list that
Yep,
you
that's
had?
where I was gonna go next.
Hmm.
So we talked a lot just now about kind of the why we do improv, how it helps the game move along. Now we're gonna shift into how do we do improv? That's the question a lot of people really struggle with. For me, one of my absolute biggest things is just a massive list of adjectives. I think the list I have here, I'm gonna throw it in the chat quickly for everyone, is 638 adjectives. And whenever I need to improv something, um, I have the sheet open almost constantly in my sessions. And if I'm unprepared for something, I can just scroll through it quickly, catch an adjective, and it can help create a character. It can help create a location. Like I see peaceful, like, oh, maybe they're a peaceful monk, or maybe it's a peaceful village, peaceful forest. But then there's also ones at the opposite end of it, and it's like arrogant, cruel, cynical. Just scrolling through, I can find lots of different stuff really quickly. That's gonna jumpstart me to get to the next thing. Um, and adjectives is just such a great thing because most of the time when you're improving things, you're improving these locations, the people. And once you get that adjective base, you can start wrapping the rest of the character around it. Like if they're cruel, well, you probably get this persona of like a little bit maybe hunched over, um, sometimes a little bit sneaky, maybe have the hood up, um, maybe a little snarl in their voice. It's so very quickly from it, you can start coming up with more of these other ideas to get them more fleshed out. And I recently saw some other DM comment about this, but as you're creating these things, the adjectives are a starting point, and you don't have to know everything before you start talking to your players. Like right there with cruel, I just started making up all these things as we're talking. And so right now I'm talking a little bit fast because we have a lot of material to get through. But in actual setting in D&D, you can slow it down a bit. As you're slowly describing these things, you just think one step ahead, which basically is what improv is, but and you're discovering the character along with your players.
Yeah, and so with characters, and like especially NPCs, a lot of times you may have specific NPCs that you have already sort of fleshed out, and you've already created like motives for them, or like or goals and drives, or the things that they do or don't like, and maybe like a voice about them already, like and it's like maybe just like a couple sentences about them. But Jacob and I were actually talking about this. I wanted to bring it up that oftentimes there will be characters who aren't necessarily like fully fleshed out or prepared for. You might have, I suppose, what you could call them in TV shows is maybe filler characters, or more like flat characters, or characters that aren't really going to be in the story as much, or at least not as anticipated, but may still need to be there in a sense. So like a shopkeep owner that someone just randomly runs into, or some random religious zealot on the street who is shouting about some new religion that he has, basically. So we were going to talk about stereotypes and how they can kind of be a useful tool at first, especially if, as we were talking about, if they go in and maybe you haven't fully fleshed them out, but maybe think about like if they're going into a tavern, like what would a general generic like tavern owner act like, and like what kinds of things might they be saying in general. They don't have to be like fully fleshed out on the back end, because remember it's only about what those players are seeing on the front end that actually matters. So they may know that you may actually have this fully fleshed out or not, but to them it doesn't matter, because it's all about what you show them on the front. um and then Jacob, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, so a stereotypical bartender in my mind is like this dwarven guy, big beard, a bit of a pot belly, and like kind of happy, but like has a little bit of that grump to him when somebody's getting on his nerves. Um, And as many times as I can throw that bartender out and around, I also need to remember that if every single bartender in my world is that character, then my world's not very lively, is it? And that's where these stereotypes can become a harmful crutch instead of that useful tool. For as many times as you have that stereotypical character, you need to have ones that go against the grain, something unexpected, like some retired wizard who got tired of his schooling and now he just owns a bar and he has a couple of fanciful drinks that just bring something more to the table. Pun very intended there. Um, and as you're improving characters, a really big thing is that you need to take notes. Um, I know many DMs, myself included, are not the best at this. It's something I personally am trying to work on. But as you make up things in a session, I can guarantee you will not remember them even 2 days later, no less a week later, as most sessions play. And that's in ideal situations. Often I go a month plus without playing with some of my groups. So as you're taking these notes, though, you can't take note of everything. You just, as you're thinking of everything, it's impossible. So I have two sets of things that I like to take notes on as I'm reminding myself. One of them I call my anchors. These are like very keynote things about whatever has been improv. might be the location that they're found in. To jump back to that bartender example, like maybe it's the name of their tavern. And then I will put their name because most of the time I'm making a name up on the spot. And then maybe I'll put like a relationship to somebody or something. And then the other thing I'll put down in my notes is reminders. These are things that like a player won't have in their notes, but as a DM, it's important for me. So for me, things that set my characters apart is I have a voice style for most, and some people do accents. Some people will change the way their voice is. Um, some people will just change their pattern of speaking, and I do a little bit of that as well, and I call it my quirks. So some characters might be very into run-on sentences, which is kind of my own thing if you haven't been able to tell already, like to just keep going and going and going. Um, some of them might be very stuttery or have an actual stutter and repeat syllables or whatever, have a lisp, things that you are note so that when they come back to it, the players get reminded, "Oh, right, I remember this character. We interacted with them before." Something to just set them apart other than the literal details that are tied to them from in-game mentions.
Mm. Yeah, and someone onto like those notes, like other things that you might be able to add as well. Like I actually do this pretty often. Is like I will go back and think about key events and choices that players make like throughout that session, so that actually before I am running the next session, I will take like whatever they did or like key events that like happened in there and think about how other important characters like NPCs or landscapes or really anything will be affected by those choices, or what are they doing like in the background, like if they end up like fighting some army, or like if they end up foiling someone's plans, maybe their leader gets some knowledge of that and maybe isn't too happy about that and starts playing something else. And those kind of little changes like that over time can actually really make the world also feel very fluid and very like organic and real as well.
Yeah, and just to bring it up, it got thrown in the chat. Danny, who's here right now, he can wave if he wants. Um, Often will do notes the day after the session, take about an hour, and I believe he shares most of those with his players. It's more of like a covering what happened in the session sort of thing. Which when I played with him, I absolutely loved. I could go back even if I missed a session, instead of having that like uh, game of telephone of what happens a week later.
Yeah.
Um,
I take about 2 minutes for reference, like maybe a minute for that just stuff. I mean, I really just mostly get important stuff. That's also just because I remember a lot of things that are happening in my game, so I just kind of try to keep that in there. But there are some things I really don't want to forget about. It's like I just kind of keep that in the back of my head. But obviously, as you might have seen from this past workshop and this one, you'll notice there's going to be like a trend where there isn't really one like exact style of DMing, and that everybody has their preferences for what they like to do. And improv is actually part of it as well, like depending on how much you want to improv and how much you want to have prepared ahead of time as well. Like I know some people like Jacob probably improvs a lot more than I do. And then I know one person, like one friend of mine, who actually improved an entire session. It's probably not the thing you recommend for the most part. It's more like a fun parley trick sometime. But it just kind of depends on what you're comfortable with and what you like better. And there's pros and cons to each, of course.
mhm. We're not here to tell you how to DM. We're here to say, here's a way list of ways that you can start going down the path and you'll find your own style. It's kind of like taking art classes where they just encourage you to try out different things until you find what your unique style is.
Mm.
Um,
I think the scariest thing for sure is like actually DMing the first session, or like getting even the courage to prepare for one. Just because like that experience can be like so new and like so daunting at first, and then after you're done like a few times, like you start to sort of figure out your style a little bit more, and then it becomes like more of like a habit, and maybe it isn't as hard as it may have seemed at first. But I at least remember like trying to just the anxiety I was having before then, trying to make sure it was good enough. It's like, am I not gonna like mess up? But maybe that's not the same for everyone.
yeah. But we digress. We're here to talk about improv.
Yeah.
um, so the next thing is what I like to call grab bags. You already kind of saw an example of this with the adjectives. But I have name generators or lists of names pulled up that just help me come up with things quickly. I'll have personalities or personality traits that I have pulled up to decide things quick. But you can do it even with encounters and stuff. Like if you're in a certain area, well, then maybe you put down a list of like 5 different enemies that they could possibly encounter and maybe have your rough numbers of what's right for the party. And you can pull it out if it's just getting a little bit bland and you have a random encounter, or they go somewhere that definitely should have some sort of fight to put up. Well, then you can pull it out. It's good to have on hand. um, I keep a list of traps, and these range from like a little string inside a shop door that sets off some bell alarm and will wake up the shopkeeper, to like wall mounted flamethrowers that will also dump like a bucket of oil on the players. Like this can range incredibly wildly. And sometimes I'll have big lists open, and sometimes I'll trim them down depending on the areas I expect them to go. Another really useful table or grab bag to have is a loot table, and this can range from like amounts of money to little lore pieces. That's one of my favorite pieces of loot to give, is just something that helps build the world. Like right now in the campaign that Kenzie's playing in, I have this odd little magic system based off of a book I read a while ago. That's just weird little markings. And as they slowly discover more about the markings, they just gain magical power. It's not intrinsic to character level, and it gives them nice, it gives me a different set of loot to give other than the usual gold magical items that often go about. And of course, magical items players always love. And you can also give just what I call common items, um, because even if they don't want them, they convert easily to gold, and it just gives more life than always saying you get 20 gold or whatever. And then at the end of my notes here, I just put adjectives again because it's the same type of grab bag idea. I just wanted to talk about adjectives first because for me personally, that's what I base almost all my improv off of.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm not sure if you mentioned this already or not, but with the names as well, random name generator websites are really great. They're super helpful. There's I think there's like a fantasy name generators the website. It's the main one.
There's so many different ones.
Yeah.
I personally like to go to them and then copy paste a bunch of them down and then have it in one big file because they pop up like 10 names at a time. And sometimes it's just too few for me to quickly find one I want. And so I'll sit there clicking through, which is why I've changed that. But I don't think I've ever heard of any other DM have that issue. So that's probably just me being too picky.
Or you could just simply name your sorcerer Tim. Or like my DM did last night, he named his two storm giants Big and Chungus.
Yes,
So
and a part of improv, like, as much as I have weird grab bags and stuff, also just humor is a good part of improv. Like, sometimes you use your improv as a way to, de-escalate situations. Like, it's 2 storm giants, like Tyler just mentioned. It's a big fight. People are going down. I believe one of their characters hit 0 hit points twice in that battle. Um, but it brings brevity to the situation, and it's a good balance to have.
mhm, sure. Jacob, did you want to talk about the last part?
Yeah, so now we talked about why, we talked about, the how, so now we're gonna talk about the when to improv. And, with improv, it's a good way to help you avoid railroading. Um, it's a common thing in D&D. Railroading is when the DM has created the story and they say, "This is the story we're going to follow. The players can do nothing else." And it is generally very frowned upon. Every once in a while, sometimes, like maybe you're doing a one shot, people understand what's going on there. Um, but if you completely go improv and you just let them do whatever the heck they want, no leading points, no skeleton, as we talked about earlier, you get what I call the ocean. Your players are stuck with their little boat of a party with no cue of where to go. And we don't want that either. So having that skeleton creates this sort of winding trail. Like if you're in the mountains and you see cairns, the like rock sets, you have the cairn set out so that people know the general paths, but they kind of take their own way to it. Maybe they'll wander off because something else caught their eye, but it sets up the way for them to get to where they need to be eventually. And the only reason this works is the only reason improv and D&D at all works is that there's this social expectation between you as the DM and your players, that the DM is going to set up this adventure, have these plot points, and you'll be open to letting the players do what they want. But the players are going to be trying to look for those plot points you're giving. They're going to try to chase them down a bit. And sometimes they may say, okay, that's an interesting plot point, but first let me go mess around with this other thing for 2 sessions. And more often than not, it ends up being a fun story everybody enjoys. And that's why D&D works so well.
And if they're really not so much of a fan of the plot in general, that could be something that you want to talk about with your players, because either you just need to straight up just create a different campaign, or just not even D&D, just go play games or something, go outside and throw a frisbee, whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, sometimes different stories can be created entirely, or it can go an entirely different way simply by something that was improv. Like I saw like a story on Reddit one time where there was this group of people that they ended up getting through this mine and like defeating this monster, and then because they figured out the mine was abandoned, they ended up staying there and creating like a new business out of it. They actually ended up taking all those resources and making like a business out of it, and then the rest of the campaign just turned into them competing with another mine.
Yeah. Sometimes the improv just leads you to finding the correct campaign. Um, like we talked about, I think in the last DM workshop, when you're creating your campaign, your world, you want to talk with your players and find what they want. And sometimes you don't find it until after you started playing. Um,
Make
like
sure you're
orig-
happy too. You got to have
yes,
fun too.
yes, it is for both the groups. Like originally, when I started off my what I call my summer campaign, um, the idea was this gritty like survival type of thing as they're running away from this invading army, and it switched from that to a very role play rich one with much less focus on those like survival gritty aspects of it, and it has turned out so much better than any of us expected originally. And that's something as a DM I think is part of your improv skills as well, is learning when to adapt the way you're presenting the game. Um, we're close to wrapping up. I don't want to talk over you, Tyler, but I had like 2 little points I wanted to bring up.
Oh, I was gonna say
Um,
after that we can just bring up some time for questions if you
yeah.
like.
So, just as I was researching things to talk about for this workshop, 2 things that come up a lot. Improv, just in general, has the rule yes and. If somebody pulls you into an improv skit, you just go along with them. You say yes to whatever they say, and then you add something more to it. That's your side of the improv. In D&D, as the DM, it is not yes and, it's you can try. The roles will determine some of it, but sometimes in your head you say you can try and you know fully well there is absolutely no way it will ever work, but you let them try and then they fail and then they're going to try something else because as a character, if they have this idea, they're able to try it. You let them take those roles. You don't say no. And sometimes they get their nat 20 and you're like, it was something I was never going to let happen, but now this is going to be hilarious if it happens. Sure, we'll go down this path.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we touched on this yet, but that kind of goes along with just the idea of the rule of cool. Like
That
when
was the
something really
other thing
cool,
I was going to
yeah,
bring up, Tyler. So you
really
beat me
really
to
good
it.
idea.
So the other thing that's talked about by a lot of people is the rule of cool. It's sometimes in D&D, it's there's things that very clearly shouldn't be able to happen, but you say, you know what, we're gonna break the rules a little bit and let something happen that we wouldn't normally. Whether that's a nat 20 on something that even a nat 20 shouldn't be able to achieve, like smashing through the front castle gates when you're a level 5 whatever. Like level 5 people aren't that strong. It shouldn't happen. But maybe it's hilarious that they crash through and there's this army just standing there waiting for them, or like a group of 20 guards. And now there's a whole new level of chaos you have to deal with. The players have to deal with. You just get to sit back and watch for a little bit there. Um, but the rule of cool, the balance is if you let all of those crazy things go through, it starts to lose its charm a bit. And I learned this very much in my Astral Plane shenanigans. I think it got mentioned last time. But basically, that one, I gave them the power to, if they could convince themselves something was true, it would happen. And as much as I loved that campaign and the chaos it caused, by the end of it, you get kind of stumped. Like, if you could do everything from the beginning, like, where do you go? And it probably would have been better as like a 3-shot thing instead of a half a year campaign, but it's a lesson learned. The rule of cool is important to keep things set, um, as like these moments are ones that will stick out and be memorable instead of anything else.
Yeah, we could probably do like a whole session on just talking about the rule of cool. There's a lot to go with that for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a lot of videos online for
I
that one.
realize we're a little bit over time at the moment, but did anyone have any questions like from the audience that we want to address here, or maybe just we should just do it after the recording?
Going back to names, the story games names project is a good reference.
I don't think I've seen that one before. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, maybe we can also link that to the YouTube video too. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kaylee. Alrighty. Well, I guess if we're done here, then we just answer any questions afterwards. You know, like wherever you know where to reach us, and we'll figure out and see what we're going to be doing for next week for the next DM workshop.